Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast, where we explore relevant projects, policies, and stories from the perspective of the communities most impacted by climate change: Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those with lower incomes. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. In today's episode, we will examine the pre-existing economic, health, and infrastructure conditions that put frontline communities at greater risk of environmental and climate impacts. I'm joined today by Zully Juarez, she/her, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at Just Solutions, and Jennifer Moon, she/her, Senior Researcher, also at Just Solutions. Welcome, Zully and Jennifer, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So before we dive into the show, we wanted our listeners to have a chance to get to know you both a little bit. You're both here at Just Solutions working together on research and policy, but what brings you to working on environmental justice? So Zully, what brings you to doing this work?
So for myself, I grew up in an environmental justice community in South Central Los Angeles, a predominantly working class immigrant community located next to the city of Vernon, which is the first exclusive industrial city in the southwestern United States. So you can only imagine the impacts of what it means to live next to such a community. And back in high school, I actually got involved with Communities for a Better Environment, CBE, a California statewide environmental justice organization, where I then attended their youth program and was exposed to concepts of environmental justice and environmental racism early on. I then pursued this interest well into my academic and professional career and have dedicated myself to this work for the last decade. I have worked on environmental, transportation, and urban planning issues and their direct impacts on public health across various sectors. And that includes positions in environmental justice organizations, research centers like USC's Environmental Health Center, and even abroad at the Institute of Transportation and Development Policy in Mexico City. And now continuing this work here at Just Solutions.
Great. Thank you, Zully. So Jennifer, what brings you to environmental justice work?
I've worked in social policy and public health most of my career, and the climate crisis, of course, makes the social and public health issues that we face all the more challenging. For me, the goals of environmental justice work are closely aligned with those of anti-poverty and health equity work. And the communities that are most impacted by climate are generally those that are most affected by decisions related to social and health policy making. So I see my environmental justice work as a natural extension of the work I've been doing for the past 20 years.
Great. Thank you. Today, we're talking with Zully and Jennifer about their recent report titled The Perfect Storm of Extraction, Poverty, and Climate Change, a framework for assessing vulnerability, resilience, adaptation, and a just transition in frontline communities. Thank you both again for being on the show. So with this study that you conducted, what was the interest in conducting it? What were you hoping to understand more deeply through the work that you were doing?
We know that frontline communities are experiencing greater effects of climate change in terms of impact and frequency, with significant impacts on community life. So for us, it was important to highlight the pre-existing conditions, such as economic, health, and infrastructure conditions of these communities, to fully grasp the reality many communities face across the country and how that may influence the way we address climate change. For example, nearly a third of U.S. population, over 92 million people, live in a low or moderate income community. And to disregard so many frontline communities not only puts residents at considerable risk, but it also threatens our ability to meet climate change and perpetuates the wrongs that have jeopardized these communities for years. So given the exposure of these communities to risk of all kinds, these impacts are likely to increase in the future without effective policy solutions and implementation to these solutions. So those were really our why and what brought us to this work. Through a case study approach, this paper introduces a prioritizing frontline communities framework for considering and measuring the adaptive capacity and resilience for frontline communities as they confront climate change. So it examines the pre-existing conditions in 6 frontline communities that are among the most vulnerable to and affected by climate change, and considers the effects of these conditions on the local capacity to cope with, prepare for, and respond to ongoing climate-related challenges.
So, talking more deeply about pre-existing conditions, in particular experienced by the communities that are included in a study, communities that are frontline, low-income communities, BIPOC communities, Let's talk first about the different indicators that you chose, like what we think were important elements to be looked at.
Yeah, so we really wanted to focus on not just climate disasters, but really the capacity that communities have to cope with and prepare for climate change, as well as to be more resilient in the face of climate disasters. We also wanted to look at how the indicators are kind of cross-cutting, like how they reinforce one another. So we looked at indicators across 3 domains: economic conditions, health conditions, and infrastructure conditions. And this interconnectedness, for example, poor economic conditions are known to be what are called social determinants of health, which degrade community health, and vice versa. Poor community health can affect local economic vitality. And in regard to infrastructure, poor infrastructure can limit job opportunities, which then leads to a weak local economy that then further reduces available funding for infrastructure investments. So we chose the indicators that were both related to adaptation and resilience and were cross-cutting.
So can you give us an example of that interconnectedness of those indicators? I mean, I guess you did on each one singularly, but like just in terms of weaving those. So for example, how in the context of climate disasters, those 3 things might actually come to play together.
Yeah, so for example, flooding due to poor flood control infrastructure in a climate disaster can lead to the growth of mold in homes, which can then cause or worsen respiratory health conditions. And similarly, high energy cost burdens or utility shutoffs because of low income can affect health. And when you don't have reliable access to power during extreme temperatures, it can be life-threatening, particularly for older people, children, and those with chronic health conditions. Or, as we mentioned before, low-income communities can lack the resources and the tax base to make the infrastructure improvements that are needed to be prepared for climate change.
And the indicators that you look at, you also look at the historic policy decisions that have accumulated to make it difficult for communities with lower incomes, BIPOC communities, to be able to survive climate disasters, to be able to bounce back from them. And so can we talk a little bit about that particular thinking and so why that approach was important for us to really look at the historic aspect and the arguing, sort of the culminating elements that make it even harder for communities to weather storms, so to speak?
So the communities that we looked at all had some history of extraction of one kind or another, either resources or labor practices that put people at risk. And eventually, investment priorities changed or the markets dried up and investors moved on and left these communities at risk of higher levels of poverty. And now they struggle with access to credit and high levels of household debt. In the health domain, they also have higher rates of chronic disease. So all these things kind of go together and put people at greater jeopardy from climate change.
As Jennifer mentioned, these communities share very similar characteristics, and they're not just unique to these 6 communities profile. They exist throughout the United States, and that is that they are very low income with high levels of poverty. The majority are Black, Indigenous, people of color populations. They have significant histories of resource extraction, labor exploitation, and or financial speculations. However, what we also bring to the paper is that despite these histories, these communities have demonstrated resilience, innovation, and even despite continuing trends of neglect even today. So by nature, these communities are resilient and they very much experience living in areas, again, as I mentioned, with high poverty rates on a daily basis. And for us in the paper, it was important to highlight not just the data that we see online, right, the numbers, but it was also conducting interviews where we incorporated community perspective and solutions to these conditions.
For the purpose of this study, you looked at some communities across the country as an example of variety of experiences that we might look at to understand how communities are faring under climate disasters and climate change. Share with us the communities that were selected and why they were selected.
The communities profile were selected for their geographic diversity. They are a mix of rural and urban areas spread across various regions of the country. The 6 communities are Glacier County, Montana, Holmes County, Mississippi, Hidalgo County, Texas, McDowell County, West Virginia, East End, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and East Las Vegas, Nevada. But in addition to their geographic diversity, the communities profiled also were selected on the basis of several characteristics, and that include economic, right, poverty or low income levels, as well as racial diversity. And then just as we mentioned previously, the histories of whether they've had like resource extractions, labor exploitation, if they used to be like a particular industry that had just recently left. So those are some of the characteristics that we focused on.
And those communities are very, very different, right? They're from very different parts of the country. What did you find were some of the things that made them similar in the context of your study?
Yeah, what makes them similar is that they are actually all very low income with high levels of poverty. Again, majority are communities of color with an exception of a few. They have long histories of resource extraction, labor exploitation, and financial speculation.
It's interesting that we enter in this notion of extraction, right, in the context of environmental issues. And we use that term. We often think about, mining, natural resource extraction, and the implications on EJ communities. We've had shows and conversations around that. And it's interesting that we think about other sources of extraction from communities. There is mining history, but there are other ways in which we as a country, we as an economy, have really stripped these communities of opportunities and resources. So, and you touched on it briefly, but help us understand a little bit more about like what is happening in these communities, what has happened historically in these communities that make them even more vulnerable to climate change and climate disasters.
A lot of them are in locations that were once more desirable. For example, along rivers. Rivers in an earlier time in American history provided transportation for goods. Now those locations are at much higher risk from flooding, things like that. So now those lands are less desirable, which has an impact on communities both economically and in terms of their exposure to climate disasters.
We've talked about labor exploitation. What's an example of some of the labor exploitation?
Well, of course, Holmes County in Mississippi was a huge cotton growing area that relied upon slave labor during slavery. And then after Reconstruction, formerly enslaved people were able to become farmers until they were then forced into sharecropping. And now more and more Black farmers are shut out of traditional farming practices as well. So there's all these continuing policy choices that we make that expose people to risk and limit their ability to adapt.
And so you're seeing the combination of both all of these indicators, these historic elements, and then you're seeing climate disasters and the sort of focused impact on communities who are more vulnerable. So you have the vulnerability of the climate impacts meets really their inability to really have what it takes to react, to survive. And I think a lot of us always think about things that we see on TV and historic moments in the U.S. history in which we've seen that really play out very visibly, very clearly, the racialized element, the elements of poverty for people to be able to, flee from danger and to be able to then come home and rebuild their homes and their communities to be able to get back to life, right? Get back to what was normal before.
And that was part of the concept of the perfect storm, was how all of these conditions come together. And without policy solutions, more and more, they will build upon one another and continue to limit the opportunities for communities to become more resilient, to adapt, and to improve their living conditions, really their health and wellness.
Yeah. You remind me, Zully, maybe you can help us understand a little bit. The full title is The Perfect Storm of Extraction, Poverty, and Climate Change. So help us understand a little bit about this notion of where you both landed around this concept of the perfect storm as it relates to climate disasters and resiliency.
Yeah, I think the concept of the perfect storm really stems from thinking about the conditions that a lot of these communities face, the cumulative impacts of it. So for us, it was important, not only, a lot of our work focuses on impacts of climate change, but for us, it was also important to bring in what are the economic factors, what are the infrastructure factors, what are the health conditions that exist within these communities? Because when natural disasters hit these communities, it's not just the climate change impact, right? We're talking about their housing stability, their housing stock. We're talking about what health issues are folks already experiencing, what kind of asthma or respiratory issues are they facing. In addition to what does the infrastructure look like? What is it strong enough to withhold any kind of natural disaster? So I think with the idea of the perfect storm, it was very much thinking about both natural disasters and climate change, but also thinking about what are those underlying impacts to housing and infrastructure and health.
Yeah. Yeah. And the combination of all those things is a perfect storm, not in a positive way, but the perfect storm in terms of when all those things come to play, that people are actually really harmed by it, communities are harmed by it, and it has far-reaching implications for, the community that we'll be talking about. Thank you for that. The objective of your study also includes the creation of a framework for assessing vulnerability, resilience, adaptation, and a just transition in frontline communities. So share a little bit more about this framework and what's included and how it is used.
Yeah, so we wanted to, as we talked about before, kind of broaden out how we think about climate adaptation and resilience beyond the immediate response to a disaster, and really thinking about what is happening in a community in terms of the economic climate and the health conditions in which people live. And so, in coming up with these indicators, we are arguing in the report that these are the kinds of things that if we measure them over time, it will tell us whether or not climate-related investments and policies are making a difference in the lives of frontline communities. So the data are really the key in policy advocacy.
So what's also exciting about the study that you two conducted is that there's a big emphasis and focus on including the voices and the stories and solutions of the communities that were highlighted. And Zully, you had a chance to talk with so many of them and to make sure that, they were of what we were looking at, an ability to really look beyond the numbers, to, have the data, to have the concept, but to actually talk with people who live in those communities. So part of what you focus on are solutions, things that are already happening in communities, things that these communities have already figured out and are doing to address some of these conditions. So can you share some of the important solutions that they've come up with to address the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, so the interviews not only ground and validate the data collected, but they also recognize the resilience and capacity of people and communities to determine and create effective and viable solutions to the climate crisis. And I wanted to share, some examples of what that looks like. And an example of economic development, there is the Eros project in East Las Vegas, which is expanding business opportunities for the neighborhood street vendors who comprise a significant portion of the local economy. The name of the project derives from the Spanish translation for vendors of various kinds, like eloteros, paleteros, so they decided to call it Eros Project. And according to Jose Rivera of Make the Road Nevada, the project reaches out to Latino vendors across the area. And I wanted to share a quote. He mentions, to vendors across the valley, learning about the effects they face environmentally while also connecting them with available resources. We have been able to develop communication for their businesses and also connect street vendors with local banks, credit unions, and online banking apps such as Zelle and Cash App to improve their income and also to take care of the environment in which they are growing their business. One thing that he shared with us is that these are street vendors in Las Vegas, meaning they're outside. They're the ones facing the heat, especially in those times of summer. So for them, it was important to be able to organize and be able to support these street vendors who really face the brunt of what it means to live in Las Vegas and what it means to live outside and work outside as well.
Yeah, another example is the work of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. The state has not developed a climate adaptation plan, so they went ahead and developed their own. And it's grounded in their culture and their history, and they're working with the scientific community to find responses to climate change and to improve adaptation for the Blackfeet people in a way that reflects their traditions and their practices.
For the Blackfeet Nation, they have the Beaver Project, which has been one of the first implementation efforts to come out of their climate adaptation plan, where they use traditional knowledge to merge requests from science to naturally store water and recharge from groundwater that really promote healthy ecosystems and heat stress reductions. They are working with ranchers on climate adaptive strategies, how they can use these on the ground projects to sustain their land base. And they've actually had a lot of success. So now they have beaver logs that are not currently holding water, but it's just releasing water slowly over time. And they're seeing this project really enhance their ecosystems.
Well, and the leadership that they have as a tribal nation to be able to create those things and to be able to take on these issues for their own nation in the ways that they want is such an important part of the solutions that need to be elevated and understood.
Another example is community members in East and Bridgeport, Connecticut are working to revitalize urban areas and to mitigate the effects of climate change. So what they're doing is looking at where there's the lowest tree canopy in the city and then targeting their efforts in the area, which is more so in the east side. And such measures reduce both exposure to industrial hazards and extreme heat during climate-related events. And we also covered in a previous podcast with One Voice Mississippi, where they lead an electric cooperative leadership institute with the Delta Electric Power Association to member owners living in rural communities, including Holmes County, to become involved in the leadership of local electric co-ops.
So when you're having conversations with community members from the areas that this report covers, I mean, what's their level of interest in having these types of conversations? What was your sense of their feeling of urgency, their feelings of wanting to share solutions? I mean, what were any thoughts on the conversation that you were having with them generally?
Overall, there was excitement. All of them were super excited to share the work they do. And all of them work with community residents. They work on the ground. And the majority of them talked about the impacts of COVID-19 and how something like COVID-19 really made things very urgent. And I think they're still struggling with some of the impacts of COVID-19. But there was overall excitement around sharing the work they do, the solutions they found, their programming. A lot of them also shared how in their neighborhoods, or whether it's their local municipality or state, there's also not as much support in terms of policy, which at the end kind of represents a lack of funding. So a lot of them kind of just have to find these innovative solutions to be able to meet the needs of their community.
I think it's been wonderful to see them in webinars that we've hosted, to participate and be guests on the podcast, to just really be able to support their leadership and their solutions through the full breadth of work that we do here at Just Solutions and the partnerships that we have to be able to put forward community-based and community-created solutions. How can the Prioritizing Frontline Communities framework you develop be leveraged as a tool for policy advocacy?
Actually, we just released a follow-up report to the Perfect Storm, which looks at how policies that are now being implemented, the effects that they're having for frontline communities. So we just issued a follow-up report to the Perfect Storm that looks at the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and how those laws could affect the indicators that we examined in the first report. And of course, the degree to which the legislation makes a meaningful difference for communities will depend on a number of things, like how Justice 40 is implemented or how states administer the funds that flow to them, and whether some of the administrative barriers that frontline communities typically face in accessing funds are removed. So things like the complexity of application processes or leveraging requirements or the degree of outreach and technical assistance. And so in this follow-up report, we conclude that the key provisions in these laws could cumulatively help improve the pre-existing conditions that frontline communities face, but it's going to take changes in these areas and also centering the needs and voices of the most impacted communities. And we also note in this follow-up report that although the IRA and the IJA are historic in terms of the level of investment, there's still so much more that needs to be done to address the full scope of the economic and health and infrastructure conditions. There was a lot of good social policy left on the cutting room floor when the IRA was passed. Things like funding for childcare, a fully refundable child tax credit, investments in maternal health care, or investments in public housing, things that would really make a difference in shifting some of these economic and health indicators in particular, so that frontline communities are better positioned to cope with and respond to climate change.
What recommendations would you give to environmental justice, climate justice groups who'd like to incorporate this community-centered framing into their advocacy?
For this paper, it was really highlighting the importance of data, both qualitative and quantitative. We won't know whether outcomes are improving in frontline communities unless we measure them, but also documenting community lived experiences to strengthen their advocacy efforts further and solutions that are found within frontline communities. We know that climate justice work is at its heart intersectional, and we should always be looking for opportunities to engage across communities. So, for example, looking for opportunities to forge alliances with those doing anti-poverty work or other sectors with a common goal of keeping frontline communities at the center.
I think the study that you both have completed has just been really great to see how we're trying to broaden that conversation and elevate that conversation, and most notably, the importance of communities that are developing solutions and are having impact. And so I always love to end on that more positive note about the good news that is out there and the leaders that are truly inspiring. So encourage everyone to read the report and to really read those interviews and to really be able to understand that there are extraordinary people across the country doing extraordinary things. So thank you both for being on the show with us today. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Bautista. If you'd like to support our work to advance climate justice, please consider donating to Just Solutions at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.